As the firing on the town increased, Mrs. Ellery, her mother, was advised to leave the scene of the tumult, and with her daughter accordingly walked out toward the country and found shelter in one of the neighboring towns. Of all their household goods, no relic was left but the few spoons that were in Miss Ellery's pocket. Now this adds another layer to the story. Who was the servant? We don't know. Was this a person employed by their family? Was this a person enslaved by the Ellery family? Sometimes when you're looking for the stories of people who are experiencing this, we're lucky to have this window into relief, and we can find traces of other people who might be buried further in the historical record. We can ask these questions about who was there, what did they experience? Did they go with them to the neighboring town? Did they have family there? Were they alone? When I was growing up and learning about the Revolutionary War in Massachusetts, I didn't really learn very much about the ordinary people living through it. Talked a lot about there being a war, the timeline, Boston Tea Party, all of these things, but I didn't talk about this being a war, and a war in their homes. People were refugees. People had to leave their homes and never return, or there was no home left to return to. Families were lost and changed. The only things that Relief Ellery Vincent had of her home, which might have had multiple generations of lifetimes of memories, including memories of a father who had passed, were these spoons. The spoons hold these memories for her family and were passed down, and through them we can learn a bit about Relief, a bit about her mother, a bit about this unnamed servant who is mentioned in the account. And so I like these spoons because there's something very familiar about them, right? We all have spoons, but they tell a story, and they're not the story I would have expected when I'd first come across them. And it makes me think, and it makes me ask my students, what are things in our lives that have memories? How do they tell our stories? What do we choose to hold on to? Now, moving on from spoons to something slightly different. My next item is actually some materials from a series of diaries, which I actually hope you'll all go read because the first 6 or 7 of them are digitized on our website. Side note, by the way, as I talked about, we are a collection of personal papers. So we have artifacts, we have business documents, all sorts of things with us, but there's a lot of family papers. As one of my colleagues who was an archivist with us described it, I spend my day reading dead people's diaries. It's a pretty fun job. It's also, side note, one of the reasons why, at the moment, if you come to do research with us, the materials you'll be allowed to access will probably go up to about the 1950s. Because say, I don't know, Alan, say you gave us your mother's diary. Would you really want us reading that diary during your lifetime? Would you maybe not even want us reading that diary during your children's lifetime? So we have personal materials, and sometimes that means we keep them locked up for a bit until it's there's a little distance for them. Now, these diaries belong to a very special woman named Sarah Gould Putnam. She was born in 1851 to a wealthy Boston family, and as a young girl, Putnam did sketches and later progressed to more sophisticated work, including oils and watercolors like this one. A lot of those works show up in her diary. She studied art later in New York, Munich, and Holland, and went on to achieve critical success for her portraits. This is one in our collections of a woman named Ruth Loring. Now, what's really special is that Putnam kept a diary from the age of about 9 years old, all the way up until right before her death at the age of 61. So getting to read about this young woman's experience, and really through the rest of her lifetime, you get to watch her grow up, which is really unique and special. You also get to see 19th century Boston through the eyes of a child, and a fairly privileged one. It's a very specific perspective, but it's a really unique one. One thing that I have noticed when putting this presentation together is that I'm really drawn towards children's perspectives as a lens for looking at history. I think that it's one that we don't often focus on and can provide a lot of that insight into what it's really like to live in a time. And moving to my next page, they're also just delightful. One of the things you'll notice here, by the way, she also has pretty easy to read cursive, which is not the case for a lot of our materials in our collection. But this one's pretty straightforward. Here you can see some of the doodles she has a bit younger. There's chickens in the yards. She's drawing what she sees. Here are a few where she went to, what did she say? It was the Aquarial Gardens, and I got to see some elephants act. So she's seeing, you see pictures, she was at a circus of some sort. There seems to be a large cat, maybe a lion. Now, when we put this exhibit together of favorite things, this was my selection, or one of two of my selections that made it in. And this isn't one of her better drawings, but I think that this is one of the most striking and fascinating parts of her diary. And it is from the date of 15th of April, 1865. Does anyone know what happened that date? Or I should say the day before. Say that again? Yes. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated the evening of 14th of April, 1865. One thing that struck me was how fast the news spread. It was in the newspapers and she was learning about it the next morning. I don't know about you, but when I think of 1865, I don't think of rapid spread of information, right? We don't have the internet, we don't have phone lines, but they had heard by that next morning. And in her diary, she writes, "Now guess my feelings when coming down at breakfast at mother's saying, 'The president is killed.' I stood so a few minutes without speaking. I cannot realize it yet. Dear, dear old Abe. Now I will tell how his death came on without any sentiment, for that does no good." Now, what's really striking to me is, if you can see right here, she has drawn a little caricature of her expression. She says, I cannot describe it, right? She doesn't know how to say how she's feeling, so she just does a little doodle. You can see her eyebrows are up, her eyes are wide open, her mouth fully dropped, and it's just this moment. I think something we all talk about, especially as we grow older, like what are those dates where everyone remembers where they were? You know, it's JFK, the Challenger, 9/11. There's so many of them, and they become touch points for generations. This is one of those moments for her. And all she can think to do is just draw a little sketch of her expression. Now, when I'm using this with students, what I'll often do is I'll take this diary passage and I'll put it out and I'll lay it down with something from Abraham Lincoln. We have, for example, the pen that he used to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, or one of his writings, perhaps a photo. I'll also put it down with a newspaper, maybe one of the newspapers where she might have learned of his death. And then I put this down and I can say, when we look at all of these pieces, how do they come together to tell the story of what it might have been like to live in that moment when you were a little girl in a household and you found out that the president had been killed? So it's just this moment that strikes me as so interesting and special. And it's just the kind of thing that sometimes you can find when you dig into the archive, these little stories of real people living through these things. Now, I told you I liked children's material, so I'm gonna move on. And I'm gonna have to probably speed through some of these, but I could not resist this drawing by one of my favorite poets, Edward Eston Cummings, better known as E. E. Cummings, one of the most popular American poets of the 20th century. Here is one of his earliest known works. This youthful work, I love the description that we have from my colleagues. This youthful work, completed about 1901, displays one of Cummings' earliest experiments with capitalization and punctuation, which would later become the poet's trademark. And I'll read, "This, period, rhinoceros, period, is, period, young. Marching by a soldier, he tells tales to him." Just another little glimpse at the adult that we know to come. And I look at the rhinoceros and the soldier with the tall hat. You know, I love, you can relate to this. How many of us drew something like this when we were children? Moving on to a different era around the Civil War, but another story that I've really enjoyed getting to follow through the archive is about a man named Dr. John Van Serly de Grasse. He was a pioneering physician, abolitionist, and Civil War veteran. Now, I first came across him when I was looking through the de Grasse Howard family papers. This is a really interesting collection that we have, and it was collected by a family who is looking and doing genealogical work. It is the kind of coming together of several prominent Black families in Boston, the Howards and the de Grasses, some others as well. And it's not necessarily deep. So there would be maybe a few items on each of the generations or the families that they were looking at. But those items end up telling really interesting stories when you dig into them. So at first, I had only seen there were a few photographs of him as his family and this medical account book, which we'll look at in a moment. But as I started digging deeper, I started to realize just how much you could pull from those pieces. So who was he? John Van Serly de Grasse was born in New York in June 1825. After studying in New York and Paris, de Grasse received his MD with honors from Bowdoin College in 1849. He married Cordelia L. Howard in Boston in 1852. She was from a very prominent Black family in Boston, and their daughter, Georgenia Cordelia DeGrasse, was born in 1855. Dr. DeGrasse opened his medical practice in Boston in 1852. 2 years later, he joined the Massachusetts Medical Society and became the first Black physician to be admitted to a medical society in the United States. During his time in Boston, he was active in many ways. He was an active abolitionist. He was a member of the Massasoit Guards, which was a Black militia working in defiance of the 1850 fugitive slave law to protect self-emancipated Black people who had fled to Massachusetts. He ended up, I will talk about this a little later, he was part of the Civil War. But before we get to that, I want to stick with this time in Boston because this is the time that we have this account book from. Now, DeGrasse seems to have used this account book to keep track of patient visits in Boston. It's simple, and actually what I'm going to do is I want to be able to zoom in on this one as well. So I'm going to show you where you could look at this one and see how I can zoom in and I can actually take a really close look. It's very, we've got the name. Here it says, visit and prescription, which is what most of the entries say, and then a price. But as we look closer, we see that there are key insights into the scope of his practice in Boston. He built a multiracial patient base that included prominent Black families in Beacon Hill, Irish immigrants, and self-emancipated people on Boston's Underground Railroad. This page in particular offers a glimpse into his day-to-day work. Like I said, most of the entries list a charge for a visit and prescription, but he also vaccinated 5 patients, 4 of them children, against smallpox in Boston. And in fact, let me see if I can find one of those here. Yeah, here we go, right down here. You can see it here, it says vaccination. Boston experienced a smallpox epidemic in 1854, and this was actually not a wildly accepted treatment in the mid-19th century. So he was working to make this available to his patients to convince them that this was a safe practice. His patient on the next page, Lloyd McCabe, who, where are you, Lloyd? Here we go. He was staying at the Lewis and Harriet Hayden House at 66 South Axe Street, which was a boarding house in Boston and one of the most well-documented safe houses on the Underground Railroad. So by this, we can suppose that he might have been either someone working on the Underground Railroad or someone who had escaped and was staying there. So these are just a taste, but what else can we figure out about the people living in Boston, their day-to-day life, the patients that he served? Going back to these photos, during the Civil War, DeGrasse joined the Union Army and served as an assistant surgeon for the 35th Regiment of U.S. Colored Infantry. He was one of only 8 Black surgeons in the Union Army and the only African-American to serve in a battlefield unit. The photos here were taken of the DeGrasse family during one of his visits home to Boston during the war. In honor of his service, he was honored by the governor with a gold-hilted sword from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. These photos are also really interesting. There's something called a carte de visite. They were in fashion at the time. It was something that you could give when you went to visit someone, a visiting card. And the artist, Edward M. Bannister, is one of the first African-American artists to receive a national award. And this family was one of his earliest patrons. So you see another way yet that this family is connected with the community, that the Black community is supporting each other in multiple ways, the different identities that this family had. If we had more time, we could also think about what does it mean to take photographs, particularly as a Black family? What are they saying by what they're wearing and the way they're standing? How is that taking ownership and making identity in a new way when living in the context of the Civil War? So there's so much more that we can learn. I'm so excited to learn more about this family, but just through something like that account book and a couple of pictures, you start to spin out this web of relationships and the way that they lived in Boston, this kind of society, this community that was here, and this really remarkable man and family. Now, I'm gonna skip through for a couple more. This one, much less moving in a way, but I wanted to include it because it's a little bit odd. This is a portrait of Charles Russell, who lived from 1739 to 1780 and was painted by John Singleton Copley. I wanted to include this because this is a moment of drama in the archives. This was not painted as a floating head. It was part of a big family portrait, and there was a dispute with his children over who got to inherit the portrait. When his daughter was unhappy with the way that the will was, going to, with the plan of who was to inherit, she took a set of scissors, cut out his head, and then carried it around folded in her pocket for a while. So, my friend pointed out, when you think about like how it's not a photograph, taking scissors to a canvas is not easy. And so I love moments of humor in the archive, but also stories of real people, real families that sometimes feel very, very relatable. This is another random thing that is just kind of fun. If you were to come to the MHS, you can discover this 1960 award, a life-size hot dog cast that was given by the National Hot Dog Council in bronze on a marble base to the Republican vice presidential candidate Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. The presentation letter reads, 1 million miles of hot dogs will be consumed in the United States this year, and we hope that every one of these hot dog lovers casts a vote for you and Dick Nixon. Again, sometimes history doesn't have to be serious. Sometimes it's just a little ridiculous. Like, I get to walk in and look at a silver hot dog. And last but not least, on our tour through just some of the standout moments in the archive for me is this painting. This is one of the most striking pieces to me in our collection. And the one that I have the most memories for in my time working there. It's titled Mess Hall, Bathroom Barracks, Japanese Relocation Center, Heart Mountain, Wyoming. It was painted in watercolor by Estelle Ishigo, March 1943 at 7 p.m. This watercolor painting by Ishigo depicts the Heart Mountain Relocation Center, one of 10 concentration camps for Japanese Americans during World War II. Ishigo was recruited as a documentary reporter for the War Relocation Authority and recorded the internment experience in illustrations. When I look at this with students, I'll ask the similar questions as I did in the beginning. What do we see here? What do you think is going on? I think it's so striking that you can see these children, that there's the color, but you also have this long and desolate place. The smokestacks, they're saying, is it a factory? Wait, why are there children here? What's going on? I also find this one particularly moving, and it's moving in so many ways, and it's showing a horrible history in something that's oddly beautiful and yet horrible. But a few years ago, after working at the MHS for maybe a year, I went to a conference for educators, and there was a presenter there named Sam Mihara, and he was talking about his time as a child in this concentration camp. And he's done a lot of work with educators and with students. And afterwards, I happened to be speaking with him in a bit, and I mentioned that we had these paintings and what an honor it was to meet him. And he said, "Oh, Estelle, she was my neighbor." So Estelle was actually a white woman, and she was married to a Japanese man. She had the option not to go into the camps, but she wanted to stay with him. She lived next door to Sam. And after the war, both she and her husband suffered a lot. They lost all of their property, they were destitute, and both of them ended up very, very ill afterwards and never really recovered. Years later, other members of the camp who had been friends and neighbors ended up trying to track down her artwork and publish it to try and earn some money for her, since they had scattered at that point. And when Mr. Mihara found out we had these paintings, he said, I want people to know her story. That this is important. I'm glad you have these. I'm still hoping we can partner with him at some point. We had plans, hasn't come to fruition yet. But just the fact of walking in and someone saying, "Oh, I know her. This was my neighbor. I was there." And so for me, this is one of the most powerful things that I've ever come across in that collection. And it's a story that I'm never going to forget. And I think, again, you look at it and it's something beautiful. It's something horrible. You can see, what was it like to be a child? Running around and maybe playing tag in this place at that time. It's just one more window into that experience. So this has been a bit of a whirlwind tour, a little disjointed at times, jumping from here to there, but that's sometimes what it's like in the archive. Things don't always make connections. There are lots of these little stories popping up, and then you get to bring them together and make these threads. What I'll leave you with as I wrap up for now is, I hope that this can be a place to think a bit both about what are the things in your lives that tell stories? What kinds of stories do you want to preserve and share? And when you look at other items, how can we find other people's stories in them? And how can we dig under the surface to find more and more when we're looking at the archive, whether that archive is in your home, in a historical society like ours, or even the streets where you live. So thank you for coming on this little tour of the place that I work and the history that I work with. I hope you enjoy, and I hope you all come to visit us. So yeah, I'll open this up for questions, comments. If you have stories of things that you have that you want to share.
I and say, what I saw first were the pipes.
Yeah.
And those are what are keeping the children moving and going.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
and then back to the doctor's pages, there was a Mitchell name there, and I'm related to the Mitchell, and I'd be very interested to know.
It is on our website. You can go and you can take a look. The materials that I've shown today are digitized. I should mention out of about 14 million pages of paper, a fraction of that is digitized, but it's still a large fraction. And I can share that later if you want to follow it up.
I have a membership, but I haven't read it.
I should mention, by the way, put in a plug, you don't need a membership. You can show in, right now I will say that the research library is a little busy because it's summer, but you can walk in off the street in a normal time. If there's space in the reading room, within 15 minutes, you can be sitting down with some documents. So it doesn't cost anything. Memberships are great. It lets you come to a bunch of our events and do other special things, but it's open to anyone, including students. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure why in the doctor's entries that I felt with that how few of them were marked Kenny, and that really jumped out at me. That it's just interesting. What
Yeah.
does that mean, and was he treating people for free, or it just because it jumped out what they're on.
I don't know.
They're on that open thing that says, hey,
I'll say in the back of the book, you'll see some of the accounts toted up for different months. So it may be that they paid later, but it might be that they didn't. I don't know. It's a great question.
I was just going to say, my uncle was a doctor in Connecticut. Even in 1920, you got about 30% of your patients to pay. You thought of yourself much more as serving the community. And so whether they gave you a dozen eggs, or they said they paid you when they had, so only about a third of the patients paid. That's true.
That's a great, yeah,
I was just fascinated. You were saying you worked with school kids, or at least with teachers.
both.
Do you have any effort organized towards older adults?
So that's not my department. I work primarily with the K-12 teachers and student audiences, but we have a public programs department, which does programs for the general public. We have tours of the building that take place every week or two. We will often do visits. If an organization reaches out and wants to do some sort of show and tell or special visit, we'll organize that. We have our research department, which also does like more academic side seminars. There's all different ways to access it. So while my specialization is K-12, you think about it holistically, right? We want everyone to be able to come in and to be able to learn about this stuff. So if that was a leading question, let me know if you do want to try and arrange a trip sometime.
Yeah, no, I do think people react very differently at different stages.
We also have a free small museum exhibit that's upstairs at all times too. So if you ever want to just drop in and see some things on display, including some stuff from this exhibit, you're welcome to. Oh, yes. I am terribly sorry. That last question had been whether we had programs available for folks who weren't K-12 teachers and students. And I was saying, yeah, we've got things across the board. Go check out our website. There's a lot available there. And thank you. I will repeat the other questions. Any questions from Zoom or comments?
Oh, here we go. Jeff.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
We're trying to figure
You all right? Can you hear me? Did you call on me? Because I can't tell you hear me.
You see how life is for Alan and me.
We need one of those microphones to pass around too. Jeff, if you can hear me, do you want to try again?
I'm trying again. Can you hear me now?
Oh, we're about to turn the sound up. Third time's the charm.
Try again. How's that? Can you hear me yet? There, good stuff. I'm just saying that, you know, I have stumbled across things. If you happen to be an old Yankee, like a good number of us around here, one of the wonderful things about this area is that there is an incredible record of history in all of our town records and other things, and you never know what you're going to find. I, got very interested in Middleboro's cemetery stones when I first moved here and did a rubbing on a man named John Morton, only because it was done by the first Middleboro carver who made cemetery stones in town. And John Morton was somebody I had no idea who he was, died in 1716, I think is on his stone. Anyway, then I'm doing my genealogy. Who do I bump into in my family history but John Morton, who lived in Middleboro. Then I started chasing down a little bit about him. I actually Googled him. I thought he was just a farmer and was of no significance at all. Well, John Morton ended up, I think his father came over on the Ann, but was a successful merchant in Plymouth. Anyway, he ended up, John was born in Plymouth and wanted to be a school teacher, which of course was interesting to me. And he literally built himself a one-room schoolhouse, started teaching school. And the thing that was unusual about him is, in those days, if you wanted to go to school, your parents paid to send you to school, except if you got to know John Morton. If he saw that you were really interested in school, you could come to school and not have to pay. With that, he is the first public school teacher in the province of Massachusetts. He is the first one in all the British provinces of the New World. In fact, he is considered the first public school teacher in both North and South America. And he lived here as a farmer. He was not a school teacher in Middleboro, but it's a kind of story that you can find in the history of these communities all over the place. You can't throw a stone without hitting a pilgrim descendant and all the things go with it. So anyway, there's lots of stuff out there if you just start doing a little light digging. It doesn't even take some heavy digging for most of it.
Thank you, Jeff. That's really wonderful. Yeah, follow up in Jeff's footsteps. A lot is available. And I will say, it does depend. There is a lot available. There are a lot of stories that might be less available. And there are sometimes stories that you have to dig through the lines of who decided to keep what. I work from a society that is steeped in colonialism. That is where we are based. That is where we are founded. And so some of what you have to think through in our collections, right, is who was considered and what was considered worth saving, who's overly represented in our collections, who might be underrepresented in our collections, what are ways to find them anyways, and where else can we look?
Follow-up question to that is, do you have artifacts and material from indigenous peoples in this area in Massachusetts?
The question was whether we have artifacts from indigenous peoples in this area in Massachusetts. We have some. I'd say more of what we have are materials from the colonizers and evidence of harm done to those communities. We have some really painful materials in the collections, but a few items, and there's been some really wonderful research done. There's a woman named Lisa Brooks wrote a book called Beloved Kin, I believe, if I'm remembering it correctly, about Our Beloved Kin, I'm sorry, about the conflict with Metacom, known as King Philip's War, using some of the materials from our collections, including evidence of one of the female leaders, a Sachem named Weetamoo, who I've learned about from her. So there's some really interesting research that's being done. One thing that we do have, which is really interesting, and will hopefully be launched in the next year, is a word list. So not quite a dictionary, but a word list of Wampanoag vocabulary. And it was created by John Eliot, who was a colonizer who was a missionary trying to convert people to Christianity. And part of the effect of what he was doing is he translated the English Bible into Wampanoag. Now, the Wampanoag language is being currently revitalized, and there's an education program to create speakers of it that is going on. It's absolutely an incredible project. I thoroughly encourage you all to check it out, support them. And in some partnership with them, we've been working on making this word list available as a digital kind of dictionary, which will hopefully be out in the next year or two. So it's been nice to take something that was from this negative purpose, really, I would consider, and hopefully use it to be part of their efforts.
I'm curious about art and is there an effort at the society to reach out and collect materials from current life, and how would that work where some of the correspondence now
So we had a question, thank you, for what does it look like in collection for the modern day, for stuff that's present, and bringing up particularly when so many materials are technical and maybe aren't always saved. Digital, thank you. That is a fabulous question. We are collecting for the present day. In fact, there's been efforts to collect stories around COVID. One of the things that they did, among many, there have been different efforts. We have diaries that people have donated. We collected vaccination pins, among other things. And we also have a site online where we've asked people to share stories. So it's literally digital collection. And it's part of the new movements in archival work. So there are efforts now to look at what does our digital preservation look like at the Historical Society. And as I mentioned, we're, lag about 50 to 70 years in terms of what's publicly available behind the present day, but we're always collecting things that are going on at the moment. And so they're looking at sort of what do the new archival practices have to be? How do we save those sorts of things, especially as technology changes quickly? What's the format that will keep it? Jeff.
Oh, I was only again going to comment on, there's the location right here in Middleboro, right down by the old police station that is the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, if you're interested in the native people stuff, because they have all kinds of things there. And it's right here in town, so you don't have to go far if you're interested in finding out about that. And much of, when the Pilgrims got here, the coastal Indians were almost completely wiped out, and the healthiest population was right here in Middleboro. And the relationship between the Pilgrims and the native people was pretty much a Middleboro relationship. Along the Nemasket, which is an Indian word for place of fish. The very first, the chief at that time was Massasoit, and we have a college named after him here. All that kind of stuff. We're very intricately involved with the American native population of early American, what we have to think of early American, but actually they were living here for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before the Pilgrims ever got here.
I would also encourage folks to check out the museums and archives that are run by Indigenous nations in Massachusetts. There are several different museums you can visit, organizations for current communities. And when you think about, I think there's a lot of conversations long overdue that are taking place about stewardship and what it means to hold different items. So that I am actually getting to go visit a museum in Rhode Island tomorrow, which I'm excited about, the Tomahawk Museum. But yeah, there's a lot of really great scholarship resources and educators who are Indigenous educators in particular who are working and making materials available online. Thank you, Jeff. There's stuff everywhere around when you look at home. Yes.
One of the most meaningful things I ever did was to visit the Unitarian Universalist Church in Quincy, where if you go downstairs, you can put your hands simultaneously on the crypts of John and Abigail Adams, and John Quincy and Louisa Adams at the same time. Put your hands on one set of presidents and another set of presidents right there, and it almost sends chills up and down your spine. There are the remains of presidents. They're in a UU church. It's incidental, but and I guess my question is, anything you want, I guess. How much does the National Historical Society stress places outside of itself like that?
Outside of Boston, you mean? Or
well, outside of Boston, but I mean,
Oh, that is a great question. So I'll just say for anyone who's listening on Zoom that we were talking a bit about the power of going to visit the Unitarian Church in Quincy, where you can go visit and touch the tombs of the Adams family, which is really powerful. And then the question was, how much does the Historical Society sort of promote, if I'm understanding right, kind of materials that are outside our own walls? And the answer is very. It's interesting working in Massachusetts, particularly because there's a very there. You throw a stone and you hit 6 different historical organizations. So you have a lot of really amazing opportunities for partnerships. And this works in many different ways. When I'm doing teacher workshops, as much as we can, we like to do place-based learning. I should actually put another plug. If there are any K-12 educators, both in schools or outside, we are doing a workshop in November at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. We'll be talking about abolition, the Underground Railroad, and whaling. So if anyone's interested, you can get in touch with me. But yes, taking people to those sort of sites. We also think about the ways that our collections intersect. We have some incredible materials. Other places have incredible materials, and a good researcher is going to want those to speak to each other. So whether it's our archivist saying, well, we might have X and Y, you should talk to these other 6 places as well, or doing a public program where we have experts coming together as a panel to speak and offer their different insights. So it's an excellent question. I think if you work in this field, you cannot be only focused on your own collections. You have to think about networks.
I have one thing to say to corroborate what you're talking about. I belong to the Friends of Middleboro Cemetery. Jeff is the president. I am now the clerk. This is going to be great. What happens when you're local, and then when you look at this Find a Grave, which is online, and you watch a demonstration like you did from the Gravestone Girls, there are 3 wonderful things where you can learn about what the gravestones meant, where they are. And do you have a collection of gravestones and like that, or do you put it on Find a Grave?
Oh, that was an interest. So we were talking a bit, I'm not going to try and summarize all of that. It was fascinating. I want to hear more about your work at the cemeteries for both of you. But the question was whether we have gravestones. And we do not. Again, we are mostly and primarily a personal papers archive. We have artifacts that will come with those papers, but we're not collecting objects like that necessarily. And there are some places that will collect gravestones. In fact, I used to work at the Old North Church, and I think we were storing a few of them from Cobb's Hill in our basement for them. But it's not the kind of thing that you're going to find with us. What you're more likely to find are materials on some of the people who you'd see in those grave sites. And even then, if you were really doing genealogical work, here's networks, I would probably direct you first to the New England Genealogical Society, and then to come to us when you have specific people that you're looking for, and you might be able to find materials based on them. I also really like that you were bringing up the local community to support the grave sites, that these local historical archives are so incredibly important, and it can't ever just be the big name places like the Massachusetts Historical Society, that the partnerships are really where you're going to find amazing synergy working together. And I have that with education too. I have some really great local historical societies I've gotten to work with, and it's been a lot of fun. Any last questions and comments? I'm so enjoying all of this, and thank you all for taking the time to engage in this
Go
with me.
ahead and speak, Jeff.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry but you keep bumping into my things that I'm especially interested in. I tell you, there was a man who in the 18...
The question was whether we are open to receiving more materials, and the answer is a resounding yes. I cannot always speak for what they'll end up taking because I don't work in collections, but I know that we are absolutely actively searching for materials, and it's on Massachusetts and beyond. The way we think of ourselves is like history through a Massachusetts lens, let's say. But there's so many wonderful stories that are still out there. We're always collecting, we're always growing. We're looking for more space to grow into because the collection keeps growing. And if you're ever interested in talking with either one of our collections organizations or something, they'd be more than happy to. And I'll also say, I mean, I like when things end up with us because I like when we have the good stuff that I get to play with. But a lot of the time, local organizations are always great repositories for those. But yeah, no, if you have things that are telling interesting stories and you want to donate them somewhere, there's a place for them, or there often is.
Me again? I'm just going to say, if you're at all interested in the historic cemeteries, there's a book that the Middleboro Public Library published from a man who had gone around to all the cemeteries in southeastern Massachusetts that he could find, wrote down very detailed names and dates. And so it's an incredible resource for anything that you're looking up about people who are buried in southeastern Massachusetts. And it's available through right in the Middleboro Cemetery Public Library. They're the ones who took his handwritten notes and put them into a book, Cemeteries in Southeastern Massachusetts. So it's a great resource.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm so glad you said that, since some of the really great things you've been talking about wasn't mic'd. I encourage everyone else to check that out. And I think it's a great point too, that I did not study this history. My area of expertise in history was 21st century Holocaust commemoration. You don't have to have a PhD in history to get into this stuff and to be able to find something valuable. You can dive in wherever you're at and start discovering things. And I hope you're all able to do that in whatever strikes your interest or that you get passionate about. And on that note, I think I should probably wrap things up soon, but I will put in one more plug for my employers. If you go check out our website at masshist.org, you'll see that you can learn about what it takes to do a visit, come look at things in our archives. You can see we have a whole host of digital collections available, things that you can see online and play with. You'll also see the events that we have. We have a calendar. Many of our events, I think currently all of them are at the minimum hybrid, so that you're able to watch them online. Many of them are free. We also have a lot of, let's see, where are they? Events, digital MHS. A lot of them since the COVID pandemic have been recorded, so you can also see them later on. We have opportunities to take part in transcribe-a-thons, where you get old documents and they're working on doing transcriptions so they can be readable. There's teacher workshops, there's tours. I hope you'll check it out. And if you ever have any questions, you know where to find me, hopefully. Or Sarah knows where to find me. Well, thank you all so much for having me and for listening to me talk about some of my favorite things. And I'm just really glad to know all of you and to be able to be here today. Thank you.